Ryan Roberts, Coast to Coast Scouting, Believe in the Draft podcast. At Rise and Draft on Twitter. The NFL Draft Analyst. Of course, we just had a trade. We'll see how that affects anything at 9, if at all. Teddy Bridgewater heading to Denver. And Ryan joins me now here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Our draft coverage is brought to you by GMS Law. Make the right call. GMS Law, 4 convenient locations to serve you online, gmslaw.com. Our draft coverage here on the Sports Bash with Ryan Roberts from Coast to Coast Scouting. He's back to talk some more as there's so much to break down between now and tomorrow. I know things always constantly changing. We have to put our BS meter up here a lot, Ryan, as we know there's so many things that get out there. But let's start with Bridgewater getting traded to Denver, and does that affect 9 at all?
Well, I mean, to be honest, Mike, I really don't think so. I mean, at the end of the day, you got a late round pick for a quarterback that has just always kind of been looked at as a stopgap option. So I don't really think it does. It makes it a little bit of a weird dynamic in the effect of like, okay, we have Drew Lock, who's going into his 3rd year, who's a former second-round quarterback. Now we have Teddy Bridgewater, who's just kind of been that bridge quarterback now for a couple years, potentially since that gruesome injury that he sustained a few years ago. And, you know, when we talked last time, I mentioned Denver as I think is a trade-up option to be in the quarterback market. I still think that. I don't think that Teddy Bridgewater is going to hinder you from making that decision. I think, if anything, this might be insurance in case the Drew Lock days are done and they do take on a rookie quarterback.
Yeah, I know at the 9 spot there, you could still draft quarterback, but does it make them a little bit more willing to move back now and say, all right, we got Bridgewater, we can move back a little bit? Like, you know, obviously we keep hearing about Philly maybe wanting to move up. So does it make the 9 spot a little bit more of a possibility?
I guess it's possible. I mean, it's hard to tell without being in the room and hearing what the long-term plan is, obviously. But I think that I still think that they're going to be in the market to trade up if the right trade is possible for a quarterback. Maybe somebody sliding, maybe you only have to move up a spot or two. Maybe, you know, it's a little more advantageous for, you know, maintaining draft capital long-term. But I think that, you know, it's very dependent on how they feel about Drew Lock. I don't think I've seen anything over the last 2 years that gets me super excited about him. But is this enough for them to say, we're going to bypass this cycle? We're probably not going to be in the right spot anyway. We're going to trade back and accumulate draft capital. I guess it is, but this just doesn't sit right with me that I think that they're going to be completely out of the quarterback market this year. I really do think that they're going to be more aggressive trading up than trading back. But anything's possible. I mean, they may have just, you know, kind of just really, you know, just accepted where they are in this draft slot. Potentially 4 quarterbacks may be off the board. Are you going to, you know, try to be aggressive with a guy like Mac Jones? Are you going to trade back? A lot of moving parts. I think that they're still going to be in the quarterback market, but you never do know this time of year, to say the least.
That's for sure. Now, at 12, you know, we had Sal Palantonio on Friday. He said inside the NovaCare that the Eagles feel that they can compete this year, that they are closer than people think they are, which is a little bit surprising. I mean, this is a team that's a little older, but did have a lot of injuries last year. But he said they think they can compete but don't want to take shortcuts. In other words, stay to their core values, which is taking linemen. So if they took a lineman at 12, is it more possible that they would go offensive lineman or defensive lineman?
Well, the recent thing that I'm hearing is a guy that they're very interested in is Kwity Paye, the defensive end out of Michigan. That's kind of the name that you heard most recently. I think the one player that's going to throw a wrench, because I've been kind of on board that I think it's going to be cornerback or it's going to be wide receiver. The one person that's going to make you second guess that is if Rashawn Slater, the offensive lineman from Northwestern, is on the board. Because, I mean, if you look at the Eagles' offensive line, obviously you're trying to figure out, hey, Jordan Mailata or Andre Dillard, is either one of these guys a long-term solution at left tackle? Lane Johnson's been beat up over the last few years, but obviously he's still one of the better right tackles in football when he's healthy. Brandon Brooks is coming off of the Achilles injury. Isaac Seumalo, for me, is a guy that you could always, upgrade. I don't think that he's good enough that he is automatically, into a starting role. And then Jason Kelsey has been kind of rumored like he's year by year, whether he's going to retire at whatever point it's going to happen. So I think a guy like Rashawn Slater that has the ability to play multiple positions can give you a lot of value because he is literally the epitome of get the best starting five on the field, no matter if that is at left tackle or right tackle or inside at one of the interior positions. I think he's a guy that would make a ton of sense if he is there for the Philadelphia Eagles. But, the most recent chatter is about Kwity Paye, who, Derek Barnett hasn't quite lived up to the expectation. Brandon Graham's getting a little older. Josh Sweat has had nice spurts, but is he anything more than a role player? So that's kind of the other guy that I would mention. But I think that Rashawn Slater, at the end of the day, if he is available, might be the guy that completely changes the outlook of cornerback, wide receiver conversation.
All right. Tell us a little bit about Kwity Paye and why, a lot of times I can't remember, an edge rusher where there's not an edge rusher that is taken in the top 10 typically. I mean, Chase Young was probably the best player in that draft last year. I mean, he goes number 2 overall. Why is it that a guy like Kwity Paye is not being talked about in the top 10 or any edge rusher for that matter?
Well, if there's anybody that's going to get pushed up, I do think it is Kwity, just because, to be very honest, this edge group this year is not great. There's a lot of guys that have talent. There's a lot of guys that have upside. In 4 or 5 years from now, if you told me that there is 3 or 4 guys that end up hitting their ceiling and they're high volume sack guys, I would be like, okay, I get it. I see the talent. I see the upside with a lot of these guys. But if you told me the complete adverse situation that one of these guys panned out because they were just all kind of, that quote unquote boomer bust prospect, I think that there's way too many of those guys in this year's class, which makes you a little unsettling to draft one of those guys in the top 10. I do think that Kwity has the talent to maybe ascend to being that. And he's a guy that was a lightly recruited guy out of the state of Rhode Island originally, has a remarkable backstory, was on the Feldman's freak list going into the season. At 270 pounds, he's running in the 4.5s. He's got a high 30s of vertical. He's a workout warrior. So all the talent is there. Unfortunately for him is he had a solid enough 2019 season. You saw the glimpses, and then a lot was expected in 2020, and then COVID hits, and Big Ten, season is very abbreviated. So he didn't have a ton of ability to, get those live reps this year. If you throw in his Northwestern game, though, this year, that was one of the most impressive games that any edge rusher has had in the 2021 class. So the talent is easily there. He's a physical guy. He's starting to get it, but it's still a long ways to go. He's nowhere near a guy that I'm comfortable saying, within the first 2 years of his career, he's going to be a 10-plus sack guy. I just don't see a high-volume guy early on. Could he get there?
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I still think that he's a very big question mark right now.
Very much like his classmate from 10 years ago, Brandon Graham, who got off to a slow NFL start and is not a big sack guy, but I guess you could call a productive NFL player.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they both play with that same vigor and physicality. Quay's more physically gifted than Brandon was coming out of Michigan, although Brandon was also a little more productive at Michigan. And then he comes in, like you said, it's kind of a slow start, and he's turned to a really good pro. So, the outlook is there for Kwity Paye. And if he hits the ceiling, he's a better player, just flat out, than a guy like a Brandon Graham. The problem is that Brandon Graham, although it took him a little time his footing coming out of Michigan, was a guy that you saw the building blocks where, hey, the ceiling is fine. It's good. He has the ability to be, what he is now, which is threatening the 10-sack mark. He gets 7, 8, 9 sacks, whatever it is in that ballpark, and be a very solid run defender. But you knew that he had a good floor because he was technically sound. He was physical, and Kwity is physical, but there's just the technique side of everything just isn't there yet. His plan of attack as a pass rusher isn't there yet. So I think it's a little more of a boomer bust, but he does have all the talent to eventually ascend into one of those players where he's a starting level defensive end and potentially a high sack guy if he hits the ceiling.
Ryan Roberts, Coast to Coast Scouting, the Believe in the Draft podcast. If Micah Parsons was on the board at number 12, I don't know how likely you feel that is, but if he was there at 12 and you passed on him, is that a huge mistake?
For me, it is. Absolutely. If you're telling me Micah Parsons, for me, regardless of position value, is a top 5 player in this class. In my opinion, I think he can literally play any linebacker spot in a 4-3 or 3-4. I think he has that type of talent. He came into Penn State as a 5-star recruit as a defensive end. So he has that rush ability. And then obviously playing in the inside at both Mike and Will for Penn State was a dominant force. There's some questions about the off-field concerns. So he may possibly be there at 12. Unfortunately for Eagles fans, though, that are looking at like, oh, man, we could get the face of our defense because we have had a guy on the second level. You know, Nigel Bradham was a solid football player, but, you know, we had to deal with Nate Gary, and I know Alex Singleton had a pretty solid season considering that, like, no one knew much about him. But you haven't had dominant second-level play on the defense in a while, and Micah Parsons could be that guy. The problem is that the Eagles haven't drafted a linebacker in the first round since 1979. So how likely is that? I think it's very, very unlikely, unfortunately. But if the Eagles did, at 12, have the chance to take Micah Parsons and they took him, I think it's a steal. Because, again, as long as everything checks out off the field, I think he's a top 5 player in this class in the face of a defense for the foreseeable future. I think he's that special of a player.
All right, Ryan, the Farley story is interesting. Now, the poor kid gets COVID. He's got back issues. I mean, the day before the draft, you know, he gets COVID here. So he's already been kind of sliding around. I've seen him on some, you know, big boards as high as, 7. Where do you kind of handicap what's going to happen with Caleb Farley tomorrow night?
It's really tough because, I mean, the talent level is obvious to see. I mean, the kid is 6'2", runs in the 4.3s, former wide receiver, so he has ball skills. There is a rawness to his game, though, which was why it was unfortunate that he didn't play in 2020 because I did want to see, just the next step that he was able to take. I think it's going to be if he is drafted, it's going to be very late first round at this point, if not into the second round, just because the injuries are, it's obviously recurring issues with a back injury now, which is very, very troublesome because those things tend to linger. They don't tend to get better over time, and then he has also history with a torn ACL, and he's had, it's a multitude of injuries. It's not just one recurring issue. Like, he's had injuries in the past, and he's still a little raw to the position. So although he may be a top 15 player, if we're just talking about straight talent in this draft, I think that he is going to slide, and I think that he could potentially slide into the second round just because there's a lot of uncertainty right now about his durability and his long-term outlook from the injuries.
Yeah, he's definitely an interesting one because you want, obviously at 12, Philly, a lot of J.C. Horn speculation with that spot. Patrick Surtain, a lot of people think might go to Dallas. Everybody thinks that he's definitively the third guy, but if he's not the third guy, who's next? Who would be that other corner or two? Because the Eagles do pick again at 37. Is there a corner in the 37 range? And it would be interesting if Farley pulls a Sidney Jones and just starts falling. And if the Eagles are in that situation again where they have to take an injured, a guy with a big injury rap in the second round.
Yeah, I know. And Eagles fans would lose their minds if they went that route again. He's more physically gifted than Sidney was coming out of Washington, but it's troublesome. Obviously, it didn't work out for you with an injury at the cornerback position, and then you have to go back to the well. I think it would be a very difficult thing for a lot of fans to swallow more than anything. Cornerback-wise, if we're talking about at 12 potentially, guys like Greg Newsome are continue to rise in this class, the Northwestern cornerback who's had really good film. The problem is he's had his own injuries in the past too, so you have to kind of figure that stuff out as well. I'm a big fan of Eric Stokes. If the Eagles were a trade back candidate, I think closer to 20 or so. I think Stokes from Georgia is a really good football player, ran in the 4.2s, has length, has ball production this past year, has experience playing both zone and man. I like a ton of what Eric Stokes is. But then if you're looking at, in that early second round range, who's a guy that might be interesting? I think a player like Ifeatu Melifonwu out of Syracuse, who's the younger brother of Obi Melifonwu, unfortunately for him. But he is a really good football player. He's really talented, physical. He's got 6'2" length. He's athletic as anything. And then Tyson Campbell from Georgia is another kid that he quite lived up to the hype just because he's had some struggle at the catch points. If you look at his work at the line and, through the stem and being able to mirror and match wide receivers and being able to stay in phase, like the kid has it all. It's just whatever reason, when the football is in the air, he's panic mode. He's just not super comfortable there yet. But again, another guy who is 6'1", 6'2", 4.3 speed. Like, this kid is a legitimate athlete. So I think Melifanu and Campbell are a couple of guys in the second round. Don't sleep on if the Eagles decide, hey, let's move back and kind of recoup some more draft capital, even though you have 11 picks. A guy, Eric Stokes, more in the mid to into the 20s would be an interesting player to watch.
Now, do you like the corners at 37 better or the wideouts better at 37 range?
For what the Eagles need, in my opinion, I like corners at 37 better. I think that Melifanu especially, or Tyson Campbell, even for banking on upside there, is really exciting. And then the problem with the second-tier wide receivers is, for me, like, the Eagles need, a little bit of size on the outside. They need a guy that's a chain mover. Like, for me, that's what they really need because, hopefully Rager takes that next step, and he's kind of that speed element, not quite the biggest guy in the world, but he's got kind of that dynamic presence to him. I think that these really need a guy that's dependable and can move the chains. And, obviously you always are banking on, hey, let's get some athleticism and get some speed, of course. But I think that's, more of a dependable guy is really what you need. And the problem is, like, after Rashad Bateman, if he goes off the board in the 20s, the next wave of wide receivers, the Elijah Moores, the Rondale Moores, all very talented players, Kadarius Toney from Florida, they're all kind of the same guy. They're all undersized slot guys that are, really going to stress you vertically and stress you laterally too, because they have a lot of yak ability in their system as well. But I think that although the Eagles could always add a player like that, I don't think that it quite fits what they need in the second round. So I do think that corner probably sets up better for them if that's their target in the early second round.
Real quick on the two wideouts, Waddle, Smith. Which of those more equipped to be an X at the NFL level?
To be X, I guess it would be Smith, more equipped. It's troublesome though. Like, if you're obviously, for your X receiver, you're asking him to play on the line of scrimmage a ton and work against press coverage. And Smith has done a great job of that in college. But then that comes into the concerns of, like, how is that going to translate to the next level at only 166 pounds? He showed that he could do it in college. I think his releases are very good. I think he's very quick. I think that he could do it. Waddle, for me, is more of that slot Z wide receiver that's going to be off the line of scrimmage a ton. You're going to maximize releases. So out of those two, I would say that Smith is more that guy that's you're going to put into the boundary, put on the line of scrimmage, and ask him to beat coverage.
Ryan Roberts is the co-host of the Believe in NFL Draft Prospects podcast, which you should definitely check out before this draft. The NFL Draft Analyst at Coast to Coast Scouting, and we'll be dropping a mock draft on draft morning. So check that out. He'll be back with us tomorrow to go comb through the mock draft, and he, like all guests, appears via the Boardwalk Honda hotline. All right, Ryan, that's half of it. We'll finish up more tomorrow on that mock draft, see who you think will go at number 12, and then he'll be back on Friday to recap round 1, get us ready for rounds 2 and 3, and we look forward to that, man.
Absolutely, Mike. I appreciate you, man. I'll talk to you tomorrow.
All right, Ryan Roberts, Rise and Draft on Twitter, at Rise, the letter N, Draft. Give him a follow. His mock draft drops tomorrow. Does a great job covering the draft. You can hear the depth of the knowledge on a lot of these prospects. Tomorrow we will go through his mock draft and kind of see what he thinks. Now, he tweeted this out earlier, that he's doing a mock draft tomorrow, half predicting and half, if he was the GM, what he would do. So it should be a very interesting 64 total selections, giving us 2 rounds, and he'll be on tomorrow to break it all down with us. Our draft coverage on the Sports Bash is brought to you by GMS Law. Make the right call. GMS Law, 4 convenient locations to serve you. Online, gmslaw.com.